everybody. Welcome to the first CEPR-EAERE webinar on climate policy. I'm Christian Gollier and I'm from Toulouse School of Economics. So let me give you a few information about this event because it's the first event of a webinar series, which is aimed at experts working in government, international organization, private sector, academics, and the media. It runs online on a monthly basis from today and is endorsed only by the Center for Economic Policy Research, CEPR, and the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economics, ERE. It's co-organized by Carlo Carraro, Otmar Ettenhofer, and myself. So the first three events will be devoted respectively to the carbon border adjustment mechanism, that is to the event, the EU recovery plan, organized by Carlo Carraro. I will say a few words about that in a minute, and the EU Green Deal. So the first event on the carbon border adjustment mechanism will have three presentations of 25 minutes each. I have asked three prominent academic economists, specialists of the field, to give their own evaluation of this matter currently debated in Brussels. So that will be Luis Garicano, Caroline Fisher, and Sam Corton. So these three presentations will be followed by a 15 minutes debate moderated by myself. And so let me, if you can go to the next slide. So let me just do some housekeeping here and save the dates. So there will be a second event that will take place on June the 10th. It will be devoted to the pandemic stimulus spending and the fight against climate change. There will be two speakers, Massimo Tavoni and Iona Petrescu. So let me now go back and introduce the topic of the day. So the EU Parliament has recently proposed a framework for a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which would be an extension of the European trading scheme, requiring importers to purchase allowance for the volumes of carbon emissions incorporated in their product. With Garicano, Caroline Fisher, and Sam Corton, we'll explore the economic and political issues associated to this proposal aimed at leveling the playing field and at fighting the carbon leakage inherent to the renewed EU ambition on climate change. So it became an urgent matter more recently as the EU ETS carbon price jumped above 50 euros per ton of CO2, earlier this week, as probably many of you have observed. So some information about how we will proceed in next hour and a half. Because of the closely related issue raised by the three speakers, the Q&A session will be concentrated in the last 15 minutes of the event. So please use the chat to raise short questions. Please don't raise too much, not too many phrases there, please, for me to concentrate the information. So I will use those questions from the chat in the Q&A session. So many thanks in advance for your contribution. So now let me go to introduction of the first speaker. So we have Luis Garicano, who most of you already know. He's a Spanish economist and a politician who is currently a member of the European Parliament from Spain since 2019. He is also Vice President of Renew Europe and Vice President of the European Political Party Alliance of Liberals and Democrats. Democrats for Europe, sorry. Before working in Brussels, he has been Professor of Strategy and Economics at IE Business School in Madrid and at the London School of Economics. So, Luis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian. It's a pleasure to be here with Caroline and Sam Corton. I was also Professor of Chicago. You forgot that bit, which is what makes Sam and me ex-colleagues. We were there together. So thanks very much. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be able to explain this proposal and to be able to hear criticisms and to think about feasibility. Here, the key questions are about political feasibility and administrative feasibility, and they are not easy. So let's just get going and hear you out. I would very much love to see what we can come up with. We presented this, by the way, last week on an event at the Peterson Institute. There were high-ranking officials at the Treasury of the Biden administration and at other posts in Washington, D.C. And it's clear that the American side of things, from a political perspective, is kind of concerned about this kind of proposals. Let me put it like that. And we'll discuss why later. And so I'm smiling, and I look forward to hear what he thinks is feasible. Anyway, so clearly we need a new paradigm to fight carbon. During the last decades, the way we have operated is by having these multilateral agreements. Most emissions are not subject to a pricing mechanism, and the fact is that with these kind of voluntary agreements, nothing much is happening. One thing very important I want you to point out, that is going to be crucial later, is to see the map of the US. Pricing initiatives, places where there's actually carbon was priced. This is originally kind of a Chicago type idea, comes from the US. Surprisingly, the US has gone for quantitative restrictions and not pricing-based mechanisms. They don't have an ETS, with small exceptions, California, etc. And so what that means is that setting up a global pricing, a greenhouse pricing mechanism is going to be very hard, as you would see. Now, as I was telling you, in the meantime, greenhouse gases have continued growing, and the EU has been increasing its ambition. Basically, we've been talking about targets for 20%, over 20% cut in greenhouse gas emission. By the time we got to this year, to 2020, we've been talking about 55% drop in greenhouse emissions by 2030 compared to the 1990 baseline, and climate neutrality by 2050. As you know, one of the huge news of this year, in October, the Chinese talked about climate neutrality as well, and the Biden administration is talking about it as well. So in terms of the objectives, I think there is broad agreement. The question is of course, fitting this with trade practices. The EU has an emission trading scheme, which is our main tool to combat climate change. It's the first major carbon pricing market. It operates not only EU, but some outside of the EU, some countries outside of the EU. And it limits only for heavy energy intensive units, not for all sectors, but just for some. It covers around 40% of all emissions. And the way it works is very simple, right? You set a cap, and then you give allowances, and people can trade allowances. So this installation has a surplus of allowances, and is going to kind of trade and allow this installation to pollute. And this installation presumably is going to kind of continue making reductions if it's cheaper for it and sell its allowances. So as the reduction of the price is getting, the cap is being substantively reduced in gigatons from 2.10 gigatons now to 1.85. You see the price has increased, and as the European Union has manifested this real decision to significantly cut emissions, we see this increase in price that Christian was referring to. This is really actualized to now. And look at the difference that we see. We've been around 20, 25 to the point where we got used to thinking of the carbon price as 20 euros per ton. And look at what has happened over the last weeks and months. It's really a very, very significant increase. If you look at Mike Greenstone's calculations of CO2 emissions, and I have been talking to him about it, he thinks that the social cost of CO2 is around $50 per ton. So if that calculation were correct, 50 euros would basically be the right price. Okay, so we would be very close to the right price. Now, what's the problem? The problem is that we have what is called carbon leakage. Carbon leakage means, look, I have a plant I'm producing steel in European Union. I have to buy all my emissions. I have to pay for them. It's very expensive. So what I decide to do after the ETS price is the emission trading scheme is introduced, is I can just move my production to another territory where basically I pollute the planet the same and I cost Europe jobs. It doesn't seem like a very smart thing to do by Europe. So we see a 21 drop in domestic carbon emissions and a 28% increase in imported carbon emissions. So domestic production being replaced by more expensive foreign production. So Europe would want a level playing field. The idea of the CBAM is that now a EU plant, in order to avoid the carbon leakage, they get a subsidy. So they basically get free allowance, where they can produce for free, and the non-EU plants just don't have any ETS and they don't have any allowance. The idea would be, look, if I'm giving you a free allowance and then you have a CO2 cost, then at the end of the day, my ETS is not doing any job. And that's what happens now in many sectors. So what instead we want to do is we want to say, okay, we're going to have a system with CBAM. There's going to be an EU plan that incurs this ETS cost, and the non-EU plant is going to have to incur a similar cost, which is the CBAM. So the proposal the Parliament makes is to have a CBAM that exactly mirrors the cost of the EU ETS, so that the carbon price is applied to every good that is consumed in the European Union. If the good is consumed outside of the European Union, the system is going to be slightly different as I'll show. So the idea is, by ensuring that the price is that the carbon content is priced, there is no advantage to the leakage. Otherwise, we get these perverse incentives to move production out, and we are going to get the whole planet to support the EU unilateral efforts, and they're going to become multilateral. The idea ultimately, where all of us, I think, probably would want to be, and I realize this is going to be very hard for the US politically, is in a climate club. Nordhaus spent a big part of his Nobel Prize speech talking about how we would want a climate club where people who are inside are trading, they are committing to climate neutrality, and people who are outside are going to have to pay a tariff for trading with the insiders, and that tariff is going to be the CBAM. You're not paying your fee for the tennis, for the support of the lawn for your golf club or your tennis club. Then whenever you go to play, you're going to have to pay, and that's going to encourage other people to join the club. So how do we propose to design it? And I'm going to try to be relatively quick so that we get enough time for the discussion, but happy to always go back on the thing. So the European Parliament approved a proposal that has the ideas is to try to fight climate change. Those are the objectives, to limit leakage, but with two constraints which we think are crucial: WTO compliance and priority on climate objectives. The objective of this is not to have some sort of protectionist scheme. So the idea of the design, the key elements of this design is going to be mirroring the price paid by EU producers, but to introduce elements that incentivize others to be making investments in two ways. First, if you're an importer that already is paying ETS at home, we're going to take that out. Second, if you are a plant that is particularly efficient at producing carbon, we're not going to count an average carbon intensity. We're going to be able, or we're going to want to count your specific carbon intensity. So we have maybe a certification agency who goes to your plant and sees that you're very clean and gives you a certificate. There are three policy instruments that were on the table that the Commission was discussing, and there were a duty on consumption, which we didn't think addressed the point. It goes beside the point. It's pretty easy to see, and also it doesn't have any public support. An actual customs duty, a tax on inputs, traditional tariff. We don't like it. It looks protectionist, and it doesn't ensure the symmetry. We want to be able to say, look, we're not discriminating. The same exact thing that you would expend for producing a car with aluminum from Europe, you have to spend for producing a car with aluminum from outside. So that's why we went for the mirroring the EU ETS, which has automatic price adjustment. It's easy politically, has stronger public support. We would want the system to to have a broad coverage in order to avoid distortions between substitute products. So if you have a product that doesn't, another one that does, a product that has the allowance of the ATS, another one doesn't, you're going to have all the substitution. Same thing with the intermediate to end products. We don't want just the aluminum to be taxed or just the car to be taxed, but the aluminum in the car, because otherwise you're going to have the possibility of importing the raw material or importing only the car and having leakage in the process in between. So you could actually delocalize the car production or delocalize the aluminum production depending on which sectors, or whether you emphasize the final or the intermediate product. So that's what we want. We realize the Commission tells us, look, guys, administratively it's going to be a complete nightmare, and the Parliament is fine to start. The important thing is to start in 2023. Start with the sectors most at risk, and then expand as we go along from 23 onwards. These are some examples of sectors that worry us. If you only go for the ones, cement, steel, fertilizers, chemicals, that's what the Commission is thinking as a first stage, then our fear is these are all products that you could substitute by cement, iron, ceramic, glass, and the risk that we see is that you're going to have distortions, substitution effects between sectors. How would we assess it? The Econ opinion says the Parliament as a whole didn't include this bit, but I think this is important, and we are pushing this idea that you wait. So think of a glass of milk, right? It says what the milk is. It's soya milk. It's composed of soya, how much soya it has, what other products, what additives, whatever it has, right? It has the weight of its basic material that went into the marmalade or the milk or the cornflakes or whatever it is. So in the same way, the car would have the weight of the basic raw materials, and then you would multiply by the carbon intensity value of that product. That would be differentiated by country, and that would potentially have the possibility for the importer to prove that he has a better system, that it has a lower carbon intensity. And that would give you carbon content, and then carbon content times ETS gives you the CBAM. So here's a car, okay? This car takes 2.5 tons of steel, 0.8 tons of aluminum, a total 3.70 tons of raw materials. These are the direct and these are the indirect emissions in terms of tons of CO2 equivalent. The steel, the 2 tons of steel is going to generate 1.75 tons of CO2 and 1.12 of indirect emission. And then we're going to have a market price here. It was 35, now it would be 49. And you're going to just multiply these tons of CO2 equivalent of greenhouse gas content by this price, and we're going to get that this car is going to have to pay 380 tons. That's the assessment method we favored. We think that getting these tons is not difficult, and obviously getting this price is very, very simple. How do you articulate it with existing ETS? This is very complicated. It's a little bit technical for people who are outside the European Union, but I know, for example, people like Christian Gaulier are very concerned by this. So this is really, really important. So the idea is this. Right now, how does the European Union avoid carbon leakage? It says the whatever amount of CO2 is produced by the best plants, you can, okay? Now look at this. I mean, this is perfect microeconomics, right? This is the 10% best plant here. It's producing 800 kilos of CO2 per ton of product. Look at what happens here. If you do a 10% allowance equal to the 10% best installation, you are actually allowing for more than 90% of the CO2 to be on a free allowance, because most plants don't produce a ton more than these 800 tons. They are all at 120, 150. Yeah, these guys are dirty as hell, but all the rest are more or less the same. So in fact, the level of the top 10% producers gives you a massive amount of free allowance. So today the system is really good. You have this ETS, but in fact, in all of these sectors in all the sectors that are really exposed to trade, basically everything means everything that is below this red line is covered by the free allowance. Um, so what we would like to do? What we would like to do is to get rid of the free allowance the CBAM offers you, because you're not going to be any more at risk of carbon leakage. You're going to be able to tell the steel producers, look, guys, you don't get to produce anything for free, but don't worry, nobody else is going to come and have that advantage. The original text, Christian was tweeting about this. The original text was called for removal of free allowances. Then the plenary, there was a huge amount of lobbying from the industry and wanted to remove it. The outcome of the vote says, okay, the removal of free allowances they don't like, but we do believe that the CBAM and the free allowance could coexist during the transition, as long as the allowances allocated for free are also deduced from the CBAM. So this is the EU producer, he has this free allowance, this is the foreign producers, and this is the CBAM. So these are paid allowance, CBAM, free allowance. So these are symmetric. We think that the right way to do it is eliminate totally the free allowance and allow for partial export rebates. What it means is, if you are an aluminum producer in Europe and you want to export to the US, and in the US you're competing with people who don't have to pay for ETS, we say, let's do the free allowance removal, but for the export, we're going to allow for an export rebate. So you get the 10% that you would have gotten as a free allowance rebated as an export rebate, so that you can compete in the foreign market. So during the transition period, what would be happening is the free allowance would be being removed, and at the same time, in the domestic market, there wouldn't be any free allowance, and in the export market, you would be replacing the free allowance by an export rebate, so that at the end, you would have, in the foreign market, you wouldn't be losing competitiveness. Key issue is WTO compatibility. We've talked to many experts. We believe that the proposal we are presenting you here today does comply with the GATT, is WTO compatible, because it doesn't discriminate between imported and domestic goods. We are treating like products in the same way. The aluminum from China is treated the same way as the aluminum from the US, as the aluminum from Spain. And the most favored nation clause, which says we are treating all imports in the same way, regardless of where they come from, and we are allowing the importers to use the carbon price already paid in their home country. So you're not discriminating with respect to those countries. We do think that there is Article 20, for those of you who are trade experts, that allows us, if you think that for the intermediate goods and everything that we need something else, we do believe that the conservation of accessible natural resource could allow the European Union to introduce this anyway as an exception. But we don't think we need that exception. So I hope that it was clear. I'm happy to go into any more details. I was below my allocated time, so I hope that that allows us for good discussion. Thank you very much, Christian.
Thank you very much. Let me now introduce Caroline Fischer. Caroline holds a joint appointment as a professor of environmental economics at the Vrije University Amsterdam and at the University of Ottawa. She is also a senior fellow with Resource for the Future. Caroline is an expert on addressing issues of trade, carbon leakage, and technical change in environmental policy instrument design. Caroline, you have 25 minutes.
This is based on a study, a review from a couple of years ago that I wrote with Aaron Cosby, Susanna Drüge, and Clayton Munnings. That started, it was an extension of a multi-stakeholder, kind of multi-NGO effort to think about, to dig into the design issues for border carbon adjustment. And then we coupled that with a review of the academic literature to think about, what does that say? How does that inform how we might design border carbon adjustments? So sort of the guiding principles are that, first of all, a BCA has to be effective in reducing global greenhouse gas emissions, and it should also achieve the intended national goals. Really limiting emissions leakage is the primary motivation, but also, we heard from Lewis's presentation, passing through the true cost of carbon, that's going to help spur demand for low carbon goods, reduce the carbon content of imports potentially, and enable greater climate ambition at home. The other principles is that it should be transparent and coherent with internationally agreed principles, both in the multilateral trade system and also multilateral climate change system. So Luis covered the key WTO obligations. So these principles of non-discrimination across countries. There is an enabling clause that does allow some discrimination in favor of least developed countries if the main aim is to aid development. So that might inform exceptions that you might make for developing countries. The main exemption that you might have from the non-discrimination is the general exceptions in Article 20, which has some environmentally related and health related exceptions that might allow some otherwise illegal measures if they're genuinely aimed at protecting the environment. So this is why it's so important to make clear your motivation is reducing leakage. Importantly, the Article 20 does not apply to subsidies. The subsidies code is separate. And so this may pose problems for including export rebates, which I'll talk about later. And then the overall chapeau in the GATT really means that you need to meet the desired ends and not be aiming at protecting domestic producer. So this really goes to motivation. Someone raised in the chat, and the other multilateral agreements that we need to worry about is the UNFCCC, Article 3, or common but differentiated responsibilities. And so we need to respect that not all countries should be have the same capacity and capabilities to adopt climate policies. So, so that raises potential conflict if the BCA is sort of aimed at creating leverage to require equivalent national policies, or if it unfairly burdens least developed countries. So that's something else to watch for. And another point is neither of these, the international agreements don't really confer legal rights on firms. So it may be easier to discriminate among firms than among countries. So there are a whole host of decisions that have to be made, and we got a little taste of it for setting up and implementing a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I will try to get through most of these. First of all, which policies should be eligible for adjustment? And we argue clearly it needs to be emissions pricing policy. And these prices should actually be high enough to induce leakage. And Luis makes the case that now the ETS price is finally high enough. For years, at 5 euros a ton, it's kind of hard to argue that there's a big climate carbon leakage risk. And it's worth pointing out there are two components of these costs increases. So one are the direct abatement costs. Here I've been my little economist, and I'm showing we have our marginal abatement costs. Firms will abate as long as the marginal cost of doing so is less than the carbon price. And then we get these sort of cumulative abatement costs, or the area under the marginal abatement cost curve. So these are the direct abatement costs. And it's important to recognize, non-market regulations would have this too. If you require firms to do this amount of abatement, you have these costs, but these costs are hard to measure, and also not what border adjustment is really about. So the other cost component are the embodied emissions costs, which Luis had in his vertical picture as emissions payments. And only emissions pricing policies have this. And this is what is being adjusted. So you're adjusting for sort of the embodied emissions cost, not for direct emissions costs. And then the other point is it should be net of free allocation. So if you're giving what, to the extent you're offering free allocation, you're not charging for embodied emissions. And so this should be considered both in the country that's implementing the border carbon adjustment, and also if you're thinking about adjusting for double taxation for carbon prices paid elsewhere, you also need to take into account if they're getting free allocation too, how much of these embodied emissions are actually being subject to carbon payments. So the, this proposal, does all of this. Oops, okay. So now, what products should be eligible for adjustment? And here there are, several issues to balance. There's the leakage avoided versus risks of unfair application. So asking, a benchmark that they're asking too much, or administrative costs. So here in Luis's paper, there's a nice diagram with sort of the similar expressions of these trade-offs. So our group, recommends you really need two criteria used simultaneously to identify the sectors at risk of leakage. And one is the high cost of climate regulation, so high greenhouse gas intensity, a multiple, and also a high carbon price, and the inability to really pass on those costs of regulations. So you're looking at firms that, because of international trade, they're not able to raise their prices. And conveniently, the EU already has a carbon leakage list. They've identified the energy intensive trade exposed sectors. You can see a lot of the big ones here: steel, cement, chemicals, etc. It's interesting, the top sectors, 7 sectors on the leakage list actually represent 2/3 of non-electricity emissions in the EU ETS. So we're not talking about that many. So our group's recommendations were really to focus on trade in these certain commodities. So steel, aluminum, cement, and some chemicals, because they're more homogeneous, they're easier, they're not differentiated products. They the more differentiated it gets, the more difficult it is to assign benchmarks and administer this. Part of this is also informed by research that shows that comprehensive border carbon adjustment, going from the ED sectors to trying to do full economy-wide adjustment, doesn't really it doesn't improve cost effectiveness that much. What it does is really shift a lot of the burden towards developing countries. So there are much bigger terms of trade effects relative to avoided carbon leakage. But I have to say the extent of this issue of sort of downstream diversion is under research. So the question is, if we're just adjusting for steel, do the emissions come back in the form of imported nails and things that contain steel? Then the proposal is that the CBAM should apply to any import embedding basic materials covered by the EU ETS. So here, obviously you can only adjust for emissions that are covered by your own emissions pricing system. And I think where the proposal is to go beyond and actually include the embedded materials. In scope of emissions, so our group identified, so you have direct emissions, that's obvious. Scope 2 emissions are energy-related indirect emissions, like from purchased electricity. And then scope 3 emissions are everything else. And generally, this is where the administrative burden of calculating, it gets a lot more difficult and complicated, and there's a lot less leakage involved. So this is from Luis's paper, so it seems to agree with us, except there is this, the decision to include indirect emissions from basic material inputs. So in cars, emissions from steel would be Scope 3 emissions. So, I mean, this is the really trickiest part, I think, of BCA design is what benchmarks to use for the embodied emissions. So they have to be product specific, but the question is how specific. And Luis identifies these trade-offs, the same trade-offs that we identified between sort of administrative feasibility and green. So how much reductions are you getting, or how well are you assessing the actual carbon content? And so one option would be to just have a single default for each product. Now this may over or underestimate the true carbon content, but at least what it does is it does avoid reshuffling. So then there's no incentive to just send only your cleanest goods to the EU and send your dirtiest ones somewhere else. A single default may better respect this sort of non-discrimination clause. But then if you want to try to get at better, more accurate emissions, embodied emissions, so one option could be country-specific benchmarks. At least here you might have the data just for reporting for UNFCCC purposes, especially for indirect emissions, it might be feasible. But here you start getting into WTO issues because you're doing country-specific discrimination. And then the more accurate would be process or firm specific. So distinguishing between a steel made with electric arc furnaces versus blast furnaces, et cetera. So this gives you better estimates, but it gets more and more administratively onerous. If it's firm specific though, you're not so worried about the WTO issues. I just wanted to point out that when thinking about export rebates, so when you're thinking about import adjustments, it may be good to be more firm and product specific. When you're thinking of export rebates or free allocation, you don't want to be firm specific because you don't want to undo the incentives to reduce emissions. So firm specific rebates would essentially give larger subsidies to larger emitters. So our recommendations were product specific and thinking about these possible options for calculating scope 2 emissions. In any case, producers should be given the option to provide their verified firm level data. This, I think, is just also for trade compatibility. And we also recommended providing financial and technical assistance in accounting and verification to assist foreign firms. This is another way to demonstrate good faith and smooth the process. And so in the proposal, I think we see a lot of this. So we have for scope 1 emissions, a material specific default, sort of probably based on conventional emissions intensity in the importing country. I think there's some discussion. They haven't totally decided what to do about indirect emissions, and they are proposing to give this option. Credits against adjustment. So as previously discussed, any free allocation afforded domestic producers must be afforded to imports. And then you have to think of, so do you adjust for carbon prices paid in the exporting country, taking into account foreign free allocation? The proposal does allow importers to justify that they have paid already on their products, the carbon embodied in their products. And again, we argue that there should not be adjustment for non-price-based policies. This question does come up a lot. Should we just take into account tradable performance standards in other countries, but they're not pricing embodied carbon, and it's just hard to measure well. Country-based exemptions raise a host of issues, including in trade law, as well as administrative burden. So the justifiable exemptions could be for countries that have, an effective emissions cap, because you can't argue really that there's going to be leakage in countries that have capped their emissions. and least developed countries. This would be, you know, compliant with the WTO's enabling clause. The proposal actually does foresee potentially bilateral agreements with countries. So that's a place to sort of navigate and encourage others to demonstrate their own policies. So this export rebate question, theoretically, this would be useful for full destination-based carbon pricing. So it levels the playing field in the rest of the world. But there, like I said before, there may be WTO issues. So if you have a carbon tax, it's most likely permissible because there are already provisions for certain kinds of border tax adjustment. But the problem is an emissions trading system is a regulation, and it offering rebates just to exports may be viewed as illegal subsidies. Nobody has challenged free allocation as being an illegal subsidy, but if it's just for exports, there might be problems. And so we see that, but the proposal is to move from free allocation towards a modest export rebate based on a high performance benchmark. A final point here, though, is that the economics modeling finds that import adjustments are responsible for most of the benefits from leakage. So this is from a study I did with Chris Boehringer and Knut Einar Rosendahl a few years ago. And so looking at, this is sort of is a cost effectiveness study. So how much lower are the costs for meeting, I believe it was a 20% reduction in the EU, comparing output-based rebating. So the free allocation helps somewhat with leakage. Adjusting for imports helps a significant amount more and reduces the cost of meeting the same global emissions target. And then full border adjustment gets you a little bit more, but not that much. I think one thing I didn't see in the report was the use of revenues. So we were pointing out that earmarking revenues can really help respect common but differentiated responsibilities. So using the revenues, either you could refund it to exporting countries, put it in a clean investment fund, contribute to internationally administered adaptation funds. These are all ways to demonstrate that the purpose of this border adjustment is to reduce leakage and reduce global emissions, and not for, you know, beggar thy neighbor purposes. I found it interesting, so that the report estimates that $5 to almost $15 billion a year in revenues could be generated by the CBAM. And I think the current proposal is just to add it to the EU budget. A point here, this is from a study I did with Alan Fox, just to show that you know, domestic policies in developed countries have a big impact in the rest of the world. So this is looking at, so if Annex I countries were reducing their emissions, comparing what happens with border carbon adjustments. So the rest of the world doesn't necessarily benefit from developed countries imposing carbon pricing. There are some costs to them as well. And border carbon adjustment actually shifts a fair amount of the burden to the rest of the world. And so returning those revenues back to the exporting countries can do a fair amount in limiting that burden shifting through terms of trade. Finally, there are a lot of issues in terms of governance that I don't think got raised. And important part is to coordinate with trade partners in advance, make sure that things are transparent and well adhering to international norms, reviewed regularly and updated as needed. And you know, part of the point of our exercise was really thinking that border carbon adjustments are more likely to be accepted and less likely to be abused if there's sort of a common understanding about how they can be done well. And so I'm glad Luis raised the United States here, because the United States isn't necessarily expressing consistent opinions on border adjustment. John Kerry is expressing concern about what the EU proposal might do to the international negotiations, and is worried that it might disrupt other people's commitments. On the other hand, the Biden climate policy, trade policy has climate in it, and they're actively thinking about carbon border adjustments. And indeed, all of the carbon pricing policies that are being bantered about in the US have border adjustments in them. In fact, the Climate Leadership Council is pitching their version and really promoting this as America's carbon advantage. If we're relatively clean, then this can be competitiveness enhancing. So using all the language that we think should not really be used to express the motivation for border carbon adjustment. But I want to point out that a lot of these proposals are actually proposing much deeper, more broader border carbon adjustment. Of course, this would be for an economy-wide carbon tax. Some colleagues of mine at Resources for the Future have done some thinking about how this actually would be run. And also with full border adjustment and the proposals that I hear would not involve crediting for carbon prices paid in other countries. So we have very different visions of how border carbon adjustment would be implemented. So just to wrap it up, I think the scholarly consensus is that BCAs, they're undoubtedly going to be challenged, but likely upheld in the WTO if they're designed well. But there are a lot of open questions for research that economists can contribute to. And so one is, I think the big questions are, what are the benefits of differentiating benchmarks versus the costs of reshuffling? What is the extent of diversion of leakage downstream that we have to worry about it? So this is, what is the value of adjusting all of these embedded material inputs? I don't know that we have a clear idea about that, because a lot of the models we use to evaluate leakage are too highly aggregated. How do we deal with different BCA regimes across trade partners? And so there's really this, contrasting views about what might the role be in climate negotiations. Is there a value of BCAs to support climate clubs, or does it throw a bomb in negotiations? So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. This is very interesting. So I see many important questions still remaining, and we have to debate that during the last 15 minutes of this webinar. But maybe Sam will have already some answers to this question. So let me introduce Sam. Sam Kortum is an American economist and currently professor of economics at Yale. His research focuses on international trade and industrial organization. Sam, the floor is yours.
I'm really delighted to be part of this group, and I'm going to take kind of the role of the abstract professor, I guess. But often somebody will say, don't explain the abstract before you have the specifics, and so I've been set up perfectly for this. And I partly want to show that, in fact, a lot of the things that have come up find their way into kind of stepping back a little bit and thinking what would be an optimal policy. So that was kind of pleasing to me. And I should say right now, this is work with David Weisbach at the University of Chicago Law School. So what's the basic question that we were asking? Well, what's the best you can do? So you being the EU, the specific, but we hope it will be the EU and the US. We hope it'll be broader than that. Maybe we hope it includes China too. That's who you is going to be in what's here. As a group, how can we do the best we can in reducing global emissions? So again, and this has come up both in Louise and Carolyn's discussion, but it's global emissions is the goal, not the emissions within your own region. You want to do it at a minimum cost to your citizens. And you do it in a world where you realize the rest of the world may be ignoring the problem. And yet you're not out to hurt the rest of the world. And you realize the rest of the world has its sovereignty. So you've got to work within that constraint. And basically that gives you just a big optimization problem, which is a bunch of quantities, which would be the best you can do. And those quantities are things like how much fossil fuel you dig up, how much energy you use in production, including, you know, how energy intensive your techniques are, how much you import, how much you export, how much you consume of these goods that embody energy. And in doing that, you're anticipating not that the rest of the world is going to have a policy reaction. I mean, you could do that, but what we were thinking about is that at least the rest of the world will have a kind of equilibrium response to the change in prices brought about by your policy. Now, an important point here, and this has come up, for example, if you think about the US, maybe right now following more of a regulation type of scheme, and EU is following a cap and trade type of scheme, and maybe the US will move towards a carbon tax. And yet, for this problem, we don't really have to answer that. That's about how you implement it, not about what you're trying to achieve. So I wanted to just bring out that kind of fundamental point, which I think means that there's something more universal than just a specific way we want to implement these policies. And maybe that will help us also when we come to the question of how we coordinate different policies, realizing that really the goal is in terms of a set of quantities, and then cap and trade, carbon tax are just ways to implement that. So here's my simple qualitative answer. You want to take a bunch of actions. One is to reduce your extraction of fossil fuels. A second is to uniformly reduce the energy intensity of all the goods you produce, but also all the goods you consume, which would include imports. So we've got in that statement everything you produce for yourself, everything you export, and everything you import. You want to reduce your consumption of goods that embody energy. You could think of that as an intensive margin of adjustment that also applies to imports. And in fact, you don't change the set of goods you import. In other words, in the language of trade, your extensive margin of imports, the range of goods you import, should be invariant to this policy if it's optimal. This is a little bit nuanced, but for exports where you have a strong comparative advantage so that you're not hurting your competitiveness that much through the carbon tax, you actually would like to reduce those because you'd like the foreign country to reduce it on its intensive margin. But then you want to actually expand the range of goods you export. And those would be particularly, now we're talking about the goods where your comparative advantage is weak. Otherwise, you would already be exporting those goods. And we can think of that as kind of an expanding your extensive margin of exports. And at this point, you know, Carolyn was just mentioning issues of legality. I'm not taking that is not factoring in here. This is just like, if you could do whatever you wanted in that. But remember, you're not doing anything that hurts the foreign country. You're not doing terms of trade manipulation. That's been ruled out in the way we set up the optimization problem. So of course, the question is by how much? The formula comes later. And I'm thinking this isn't the greatest venue for a formula I'm going to show you, but I want to go through this part slowly, more of these qualitative points. Okay, so what's the economic rationale for that set of statements about what you should be trying to do? Well, one of the key things we're finding, and in fact, we find this is one of the most important quantitatively when we put this on the computer, is you want to balance lower supply, meaning lower supply of energy, along with lower demand through reducing demand. And we often only talk about the demand side, but you want this balance of the two, and that's going to moderate the fuel price effect, the equilibrium effect of the world energy price, which is partly, that's the thing that the rest of the world's responding to. So you want to get that price to be the one that gets the rest of the world's response to be what you'd like it to be. So part of that is to reduce fossil fuel extraction or supply. Notice that that reduction in supply, all things equal, that will raise the global energy price. And so you balance that by reducing demand, which is what we usually talk about. And the key new thing here is you want to hit all the possible margins you can think of. But anyway, that reduction in demand is going to push down the global energy price. And so that, again, is what you want to balance. Okay, so what are all these different possible margins? Some are obvious, some are not so obvious. You want to produce with energy-saving techniques. You want to dictate, meaning have maybe a regulation that requires that those goods that you import are also using those techniques. And in this setup, you would demand the same techniques of the foreign producer of the goods you're importing as you would have required of your own producers. So that's kind of there's this sort of equality there. You want to consume less of energy-intensive goods, that's obvious. You want to export less of goods that the rest of the world would never think of producing for themselves, because you have such a strong comparative advantage that even if your price goes up, you're still going to be the one who they would want to buy from. You want to lower that. But then you want to start exporting goods to the rest of the world that you would otherwise, that they would otherwise produce with more fossil fuels. So that's the logic of this thing that may run in, may hit a brick wall with the World Trade Organization. But the logic is you would like to some degree, crowd out their production of goods you can produce almost as cheaply while producing them in a much more energy efficient manner than they would have produced them. Okay, now with apologies to the EU, emissions trading system, I want to start by talking about how to think about this in terms of carbon taxes. But I think in the broader picture, that's critical because we may be having to coordinate at some point between a carbon tax system and an emission trading system. So we might as well kind of get used to that. So let me start by thinking about carbon taxes. I'm doing that partly because that's how David and I have always thought about it. So I feel like I'm kind of more like know what I'm talking about here. When I get into the emission trading system, I'm a little more shaky. But as Carolyn mentioned, there are bills in Congress now, and a lot of them have this feature that you start with a tax way upstream on extraction. Now that's very practical because there are not that many sources of extraction, so you can apply the tax just to a few, my co-author says 2,500 or so extraction locations, coal mines, gas wells, and so on. Okay, so you're taxing the energy sector, and the tax is a very familiar one. It's the Pigouvian one, with the tax rate equal to the marginal harm. And in this world where you're not trying to hurt the rest of the world, the marginal harm is actually the global marginal harm. Like how much is the world made worse off when I take business class to Europe rather than going economy class? Okay. Then you want to have a partial border adjustment on energy, because we're starting with energy, so we have to think of a border adjustment on raw energy at this point. It's partial in the sense that the border adjustment is at a lower rate than the tax on extraction itself. So that leaves a little bit of the tax on the extraction, which was the whole point. You want to tax a little bit the supply side. You don't want to let them off scot-free. So that pushes part of the tax downstream to producers, but leaves some of it on the extractors. So that achieves one of our goals. Those same partial CBAs, the same level of the CBA that applies to, you know, petroleum imports of the US or of Europe, would be applied to the carbon content of goods imports. And that's what leaves the import margin unchanged relative to no policy. That gives us this invariance. But there are no CBAs. This is very close to a lot of work that Carolyn's done. There are no CBAs for exports of goods. Instead, you replace that with a subsidy per unit of export. And if possible, you'd like to do that only to your exporters who really need it, because the exporters who don't need it, you'd rather they reduce their exports, because that will get foreign to consume less of those energy intensive goods. So that has the effect of expanding the margin of exports relative to no policy. Okay, so just to end, okay, I said this kind of looks like the bills in Congress. From the beginning it does, but what they do is put full CBAs on everything, on the energy imports if there are some, on the energy exports if there are some, on the goods at the same rate, and pushes it all downstream to being like a pure consumption tax. Albeit they only talk about applying it to the more energy intensive trade, you know, that group of goods that also is coming up in Luis's talk. But anyway, they leave the burden off the extractors, and they leave the burden off the goods exporters, which we think you would like to keep on there if you could. So finally, let me get to the CBAM. And this is where I'm a little more tentative, but I had some thoughts, which is that just remember again that carbon border adjustments were not part of our maximization problem. It just had a bunch of quantities. It could have never, you know, it never even had to think about a concept like a border adjustment. It just says what has to happen with quantities. And yet, those border adjustments emerge when we think about getting to the policy, implementing the policy. And I think at some level, that is a defense of CBAM. I think it's a rationale for kind of a deep, I would say, rationale for CBAM. Oh, whoops, this is repeating what I just said. So what are some features beyond that of the optimal CBAs coming out of our problem, out of our optimization problem, that are in fact found in the CBAM? So there are quite a few of those. The CBAs on the imported goods impose the green incentives on importers. So that's important. It's important that the producers of those goods in the rest of the world actually realize, oh, if we produced with less energy, we'd pay less carbon, we'd pay less tax, and therefore they would do that. And therefore we're spreading some of the effort to solve climate change over the rest of the world inadvertently, because they want to be able to sell those goods to us meaning, say, the EU. We would say there should be no CBAs, and I mean, a more careful reading is required, but I think close to what Louise suggested would be, forget about the CBAs for the exported goods. So you want to retain the green incentives for your exporters. You don't want them to say, oh, I'm exporting it so I can be as dirty as I want, because they just repay us everything we paid on that. But you can achieve that with the free allowances. So I think the free allowance does it to exporters. I hope it's legal, because it really captures that idea of an allowance, which, you know, you get the allowance as an exporter. That doesn't mean you're going to be dirty. If you can be clean for less money, turn around and sell it to somebody else, and you have that incentives. And that is a feature of I always give Carolyn credit, because I read it in that kind of logic in one of her papers with Fox, and it really resonated with me. Okay, to promote, yeah, okay. But features not found, I mean, I guess a question is, what about this thing of the energy extraction? Even though Europe's not a powerhouse in energy extraction, it still would make a difference. And maybe the balance of that does matter, and maybe that could be added on in some way with regulation or taxes, or maybe I'll be corrected that it's somehow part of it, but I didn't see where the energy extraction was kind of reduced to kind of balance these demand side effects of the emissions trading system along with the CBAM. Okay, now, Christian, how long do I have? I couldn't hear you. I think you're muted.
5 minutes.
5 minutes left.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, I have a lot of stuff here, and I meant to go through it quickly. So I just, believe me, there's a model, and I wanted to talk a little about how carbon works in the model. Carbon comes out of the earth through energy extraction. It's then embodied in energy trade. It's released into the atmosphere in the process of production. And then it's embodied in goods that we trade, and we think of carbon embodied in consumption. We trade those goods. And so we can track carbon all the way from the extraction to the consumption. And that means if we all got into this same, if we all coordinate on a policy, then we'd have lots of leeways in how we did the tax. We could tax it we could tax upstream, we could tax midstream, we could tax downstream, it wouldn't even matter. All this issue of the taxation is coming in because every country, every region's not on board. Okay. And this is just kind of foundational papers for this work we're doing. Particularly, I want to credit Markson. Okay. So there's a big planning problem. I said there's a big optimization problem, and it has to do with thinking of a social planner in this home country. The word "you" has now been replaced by home, and the word "rest of world" is replaced by foreign. And they're just solving a big maximization problem to make home as well off as possible without reducing welfare of foreign. Okay, so the solution is 3 wedges. The first one is a wedge, kind of the demand side wedge, which says that the marginal product of energy used in home better be higher than the price of energy. And the price of energy is the marginal product of energy in foreign, because they're not doing anything. But you want to create that wedge. You don't want to use energy in the home country unless it's really going to have a payoff for you by the amount lambda E rather than PE. So that's the first wedge. The second wedge is on the extraction side. You want the return that an extractor gets in the home country to be lower than the price of energy, whereas in the foreign country, they just get to sell it for PE. You only let your extractor sell it for lambda E minus the social cost of carbon. It turns out that that difference is less than PE, so you're giving a lower return to extraction. And then there's a complicated one, which I'm going to skip over. And here's that. So now we kind of think, I said there's an equation that determines the level of these border adjustments and so on. We know the level of the extraction tax, the nominal tax is easy. It's just the Pigouvian level. The effective tax is the difference between this Lagrange multiplier and that phi W, and it gets solved by having market clearing in the energy market for the world, and this kind of balancing act in that first equation that balances the 3 wedges, where the balancing weights are the amount by which the foreign guy is undercutting you with his behavior, either with respect to extraction, use of energy in production, that's the GE star, or consuming more of the energy of the goods that you're implicitly subsidizing to crowd out their production of those goods in a more dirty manner. Okay, so now what I want to do, okay, I think in the interest of time, I'm going to just jump ahead to some pictures. Okay, let me start, because in our paper, we're usually thinking of the home country as not just being the EU, but the US has now joined it, Japan has now joined it, et cetera. It's the whole OECD. And we're all trying to coordinate a carbon tax and a emission trading scheme and so on. I'm going to describe it all as if it was a carbon tax. So what you basically can do is, depending on how much you think the marginal harm is, that's going to determine your carbon tax. And that's the yellow dotted line there. And so you have your extraction tax just goes up in proportion to the harm. And then your border adjustment is some fraction of that. And the difference is the amount that stays as an effective tax on extraction of energy in the home country. Okay. And what does that achieve? Well, you lower world emissions from 32 gigatons down to 24 gigatons if you really are putting a high marginal harm on emissions. Now, here's the way in which having a big coalition is helpful. And look at the left picture, which I like better. It shows you a trade-off that at a higher economic cost on the left, on the horizontal axis, what you can achieve in terms of global restrictions, and then what curve you're on depends on how broad your coalition is. If you have the whole world, you can get up to reducing emissions by 60%. If you're only the EU on your own, it looks kind of pathetic what you can achieve, but that's not bad. I mean, I think the EU is playing the role of a leader and saying, look, we can do this, you do it too, and if we all get together, maybe we'll be more like the OECD or say the red one where we get China on board, and then we're getting pretty close to what the whole world could achieve. Okay, so that's the lesson of that picture. Get a big coalition. Our paper doesn't say how, it just says that that would be beneficial. That's what Nordhaus was talking about, though, with Louise mentioned. But now let's zero in on the EU and think about different policies. So we said the EU can't achieve that much on its own. What do I mean by that? They can reduce their emissions drastically, but when I say how much, I mean global emissions. It's not going to look that impressive. However, I don't want to say that in a negative way, because I think, again, it's the idea that other countries will get on board. Okay, here's how they can improve things by going from a pure production, the blue dotted line, I'm looking at the left picture again. The blue dotted line is a production tax, which is very similar to the current ETS. The current ETS is on production. Okay, now, if they turn it into a consumption tax, which is sort of the direction that is being entertained with the CBAM, they move up to the orange dashed line. So that's better. If you kind of optimized, kind of compromise between those two, you don't do that much better. But where you do a lot better is if you start mixing the demand side policy, in fact, whether it be a consumption or a production tax, and the supply side policy, and then you move to the red dotted line, and you're pretty close to the best you could do, given your, you know, if EU's doing it on its own, they can do almost as well as they could do by just this combination of extraction tax and consumption tax. And not shown here, they can do pretty darn well actually by combining a production tax and an extraction tax. So my main message is that we need to think about, get the extraction tax or some sort of reduction in extraction into the discussion. And otherwise, many of the features that we were kind of just finding were optimal without having looked at Louise's paper ahead of time turned out to have features in his proposal. So let me stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam.
There are a lot of great questions going on in the chat. It's hard to keep. I think it's actually a little easier for attendees in the Q&A, because then the questions stay there and give us an opportunity to answer them too. So I was pointing out that that's a big question for reshuffling. So you know, if you have a large manufacturer making products for both EU and non-EU consumption, just buy a couple renewable energy certificates for the EU, but it doesn't really reflect significantly lower emissions intensity. So I think that's why both in our study and Luis's proposal don't seem to
Luis?
take that into consideration.
Luis, you would like to add something about that?
Yes, no, very much in agreement with Caroline. I mean, I was writing in the chat, an electron is an electron. I think you have to put the average energy mix because they're always going to find some renewable that they can just plug into their dirty industries and say, well, we're doing it with renewable. But then some other domestic firm is being plugged instead to the dirty electricity, and then the whole thing gets faked. So I think it shouldn't be taken into account, and you shouldn't allow the resource shuffling.
There are questions related to non-price regulation. How can our European Union could take into account non-price policies in the US, for example?
I'd love to hear Sam about it, and Colin definitely, because this is the politically, when we have talked to the people in the US, this is politically the hardest thing, right? They say, look, we're doing a big effort. When we introduced in the Obama administration in 2015 some methane reduction measures, then we closed, I don't know how many coal mines and thermal plants. And that was a huge reduction. And you guys are not going to take into account because it doesn't show up in prices. And they have a point. And some people are saying, well, you should just look at implicit prices, at what is the implied price of this regulation. I think that's really hard. Caroline is thinking the same.
The point is, so if a country is undertaking all of these, ambitious non-pricing efforts, that will show up in their emissions intensity. So they will get credit that way by having lower emissions intensity to be adjusted.
Point.
And as I was pointing out before, non-pricing policies they don't have to pay for their embodied emissions, and fundamentally that's what you're adjusting with a CBAM.
Yeah, the one thing I was going to add, this kind of relates to the last question, which I was kind of slow to pick up on. That what we're in the setup we have, we kind of introduced then a bunch of types of energy, including renewables, varying by carbon intensity, and what we under some assumptions about tradability and so on, thinking of maybe petroleum as the kind of one type of energy that trades a lot, you would like to be thinking about the marginal source of energy. What would be the type of energy that a slight decrease in price would remove from that country's mix, or a slight increase in price would bring about? And then that's the one that's very relevant to you. And I think maybe one could think about what Carolyn just said in those terms of sort of how maybe the US's marginal source of energy is going to be changing, and that should matter actually in this kind of calculation.
Yeah. That's an interesting point, because the marginal source is what you're going to be squeezing out, but I think that's would be very difficult to implement. I mean, what you have, you have limited data from other jurisdictions about what's going on, and so you have much better data about average than marginal, and showing what is going to be crowded out. I think is rather difficult.
Okay.
We do experience these changes in the energy price, so it doesn't seem impossible. I mean, we see what happens when, energy prices go down, and maybe Canada stops getting much of coal sands or something like that, or or maybe we're in the US, if all we're doing is building windmills, then that's starting to seem like the marginal source. I still feel like there could be.
Yeah, I guess the question is, can in sort of an international trade policy, can you use econometrically based metrics as opposed to simple statistics?
Could we move on to other questions? There are questions related to revenue, the use of the revenue. So my personal view is, I think if we don't redistribute the revenue to the EU consumers, there will be an acceptability problem. Keep in mind that most of that border adjustment will be paid by the consumer rather than the producer. So returning the revenue to the exporter is probably, I think, not a good idea. Yes, and I hear many people saying, "Oh, let's ask the Chinese pay, let the Chinese pay for greening our economies." I mean, it just utopia. So I don't know whether you want to react about that.
That's the question. I mean, but there is. I would push back a little bit that not all of it will be passed forward to EU consumers. Some of it will be passed back to the exporters, and I think the concern is a lot of that. To the extent that those exports are from developing and emerging economies, it helps demonstrate good faith if you use the revenues, towards environmental ends. So I think if the revenues were earmarked towards, green, clean energy, clean production improvements in the EU, that wouldn't be too bad. So it's demonstrating that it has an environmental purpose. But our group thought that it'd be even better if some of that is going back to assist developing countries in their clean development.
Somehow in the US, it's become such an issue about climate equity and so on. I feel like the bill I was mentioning in Congress just says rebate it per person, all the revenue, which seems like a winner politically, that there's so much kind of populist backlash against these sorts of attempts to do good for the world, and that makes it very tangible. Look, you're actually, except for the guy going business class, you may be getting back more than you're actually paying for the tax. It just seems like a pretty compelling type argument.
So Caroline,
yeah. Sorry, let's make a distinction between, the revenues from the emissions pricing system in the first place versus the BCA revenues. I think that.
Okay, I was putting those together.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah.
So in the European Union context, I mean, even though I can see that there are some advantages politically, what Sam says is ideal, and legally what Caroline said in terms of allowing it to do good would be very good. I think in the European Union, the earmarking of the revenues would not agree with the agreement on budgetary discipline, on the interinstitutional agreement. It wouldn't be legal. So I think it needs to go towards the own resources and to finance the European Union budget, and that's our position in that regard.
Well, I'm in France, and we had the experience of the Yellow Vest, and we know that at least for France, if we do not return the revenue to the consumers, in particular to the lower, the poorer people, I mean, we have an acceptability problem. It's close to the end, so let me try to get to one last question, and I would like to particularly address the question to Luis. So what's the probability of having a CBM soon working in Europe, given the high price and the ETS? I mean, there is some degree of urgency here. And associated to that question, and probably it's not good to finish with that because it's a negative tone, but what happens if the CBM proposal in Europe fails?
My sense is that we are going to have a European Commission proposal in July. I think that the Parliament is quite united in proceeding, and I think the Council, this proposal, ETS-based proposals, don't need unanimity. So I think that given that there's no unanimity, I think it could pass as well. The key issue is, of course, international trade repercussions, and to me, the proposal the Commission is thinking about with these 6-7 products that Caroline also was mentioning is a proposal that the US doesn't export any of those things to Europe. Basically, Russia does, and China, and all sorts of other countries. So the risk would be the US, and since this is not really affected by the US, I think it might be politically feasible. But it has that big question mark. What happens?
Okay, thank you, Sam. What's your feeling about that?
I'm going to pass on that one.
Okay, Caroline.
Sorry, I was trying to answer something.
So what's the risk of having the CBM proposal failing in Europe, and what would be is there any plan B? That's one question on the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the tricky thing. I mean, the plan B is existing, you know, is free allocation. And that has been the main policy tool for addressing carbon leakage up till now. And it's been adequate in part because the ambition hasn't been as huge. But as we're trying to get down to net zero, there aren't going to be any allowances to allocate, So that's really the issue, that if we're if you're asking EU producers to switch to higher cost, ultra low carbon technologies, you don't have a lot of alternatives there. The alternatives turn to subsidies. And like we said, they're not as efficient because then you're not asking consumers to pay for the carbon opportunity cost, and you're not incentivizing alternative materials. So it's tricky. It's hard.
We agree. Okay, let me finish with this last debate on the probability of success, and let us cross our fingers, because if we fail there, I think it will be very hard to impose a pricing mechanism, which we know is absolutely necessary if we want to go to zero net emission. So thank you, all of you, in particular the two speakers, Sam, Luis, and Caroline. Thank you also to CEPR to organize this event, and I remind you that we have this next webinar on June 10. Yes, that one on June 10 on greening the recovery plans in Europe. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Merci beaucoup. Thanks for the questions to all, and great event. Thank you.